Today's episode is brought to you by Cogni. Have you ever wondered why you keep getting spam calls or why scammers seem to know all of your personal information? I'll tell you why. It's data brokers. These companies, they collect and sell private data, specifically your private data. It makes you an easy target for scams, for identity theft, and privacy breaches. Take the BT Group ransomware attack. Thousands of people's information got leaked, and once it's out there, it's not going back in. Once the box is open, it's Pandora's box of your personal information, isn't it? But that's where Incogni comes in. Instead of spending hundreds of hours trying to remove your data from shady databases, Incogni does it for you, automatically. Right now, you can get 60% off an annual plan with the code SHADOWS at incogni.com/shadows. Look, your data's out there, unless you do something about it. Take back control with Incogni. There's a link below, and thank you to them for sponsoring. The nights of June 1955 were pleasantly cool in Okayama, Japan, roughly halfway between Osaka and Hiroshima. But the young parents in the area were nonetheless kept awake by one of the most distressing, yet natural and frequent sounds ever found in nature: the cry of a distressed baby. Their first reaction, as parents have always done and will always do, is to feed their children. Some of those babies were breastfed by their mothers, while others were tenderly embraced by either mom or dad and given a nice bottle of formula milk, reinforced with vitamins and minerals. After all, this was what many doctors were recommending at the time. But the dried milk, its cans emblazoned with the image of a watchful angel, seemed to not satisfy the babies, and they kept on crying. The puzzled parents then prepared another bottle, but the cries kept on piercing the air through the night and into the day. Unbeknownst to the parents of Okayama and other cities across the islands of Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu, that milk was not just enriched with vitamins, it had been laced with a deadly poison: arsenic. This is the story of the Morinaga baby milk arsenic incident, a story which began with the poisoning of thousands of innocent souls and continued with the decades-long battle waged by their parents to bring to account those responsible for the tragedy. From June to August 1955, thousands of children aged 12 months or below in western Honshu, Shikoku, and Kyushu presented with some worrying symptoms: diarrhea, constipation, vomiting, a swollen abdomen, and darkened skin. Clearly in distress, the infants could not stop crying, nor could they explain what was wrong. The equally distressed parents continued bottle feeding them as they had done before. The cause of the mysterious syndrome remained unknown until the first patient was finally taken to the Okayama University Medical School Hospital on July 23rd. After several days of tests and examinations, medical professionals discovered the truth. A total of 13,451 babies had been poisoned with the formula milk produced by the Morinaga company that was tainted with arsenic. To clarify, the contamination was not voluntary and no malice was involved. The poisoning of such a delicate and important product, however, had been the consequence of poor industrial practices, gross negligence, and a reckless drive for profits. This case proved that when corporations cut corners, children suffer. According to a 1956 survey conducted by the Japanese Ministry of Public Welfare, 130 babies died almost immediately as a consequence of the poisoning. In the following decades, this number would grow manyfold, as would the number of people left with permanent mental and physical disabilities. After that first patient was seen on July 23rd, more and more distraught parents rushed their babies to hospital. But doctors could not identify the root cause of those symptoms and ventured several hypotheses. The head of medicine at Okayama Red Cross General Hospital speculated that the ill babies, with their swollen stomachs and darkened skin, suffered from a fungal infection, a side effect of antibiotic use. As he declared to newspaper Sanyo Shinban, quote, "Some antibiotic medicines, such as penicillin, cause the whole body to become moldy and the skin to turn black. Pediatricians at the University Medical School Hospital also linked the strange symptoms to the side effects of antibiotics. But according to them, children had developed a yeast infection or septicemia caused by Candida albicans." According to a Tara note, writing for the Museum of Morinaga Arsenic Milk Poisoning Incident, one of the first patients to present at the Red Cross General Hospital was the 8-month daughter of a Sanyo Shinbun journalist identified only as Mr. K. In early August, Mr. K's daughter and 10-month-old niece suffered from severe diarrhea and were taken to the hospital. While there, Mr. K spoke to the nurses and learned about the mysterious syndrome afflicting the babies of Okayama. Amongst the already mentioned theories, he was told that the babies might have been suffering from heat stroke or anemia. But when discussing the specific cases of his daughter and niece, Mr. K was told by a doctor, quote, "You do not have to worry, but stop using the Morinaga powdered milk and change to one from another company." At that stage, no medical professional, let alone representatives of Morinaga, had made any official connection between the ill babies and the company's dried milk. Nonetheless, Mr. K heeded the advice, and the two babies soon recovered. Puzzled by the incident, the journalist wrote an article due for publication on the morning edition of August 10th. His first draft included a mention of infants who had been fed Morinaga powdered milk. But Mr. K's editors changed the phrase to infants who had been bottle-fed, and the article was published in the evening edition of the paper. Moreover, in this final edit, the attention had been heavily shifted to summer heat and anemia as the culprits. Quote, "Extreme cases are exhibiting symptoms similar to those of leukemia sufferers. In those instances, patients have lost up to a quarter of their blood and have required treatments such as blood-forming medicine or blood transfusions." End quote. Based on Mr. K's account, it appears that the Red Cross Hospital was already aware of the link between the Morinaga brand's milk and the strange syndrome sometime before August 10th. By August 13th, the pediatrics department at the same hospital had worked out that all the ill babies had consumed cans of milk marked with the specific code MF. This two-letter code indicated the specific factory in which the product had been powdered and packaged, with MF identifying the Tokushima plant. This was an important breakthrough. It suggested that the cause of the symptoms was not the milk itself, but rather specific manufacturing steps and/or ingredients linked to that specific plant. But what exactly? That final mystery would be solved by Dr. E.G. Hamamoto, professor of pediatrics at Okayama University. Based on the symptoms observed, he speculated that the children suffered from metal or metalloid poisoning. Professor Hamamoto had some specific culprit in mind, but he needed proof, and thus he asked his university's Department of Forensic Medicine to test the milk. On August 23rd, the lab presented their results, which confirmed Hamamoto's suspicion. Finally, on the 24th, the Okayama prefectural government asked the professor to present the evidence to the media and the public. To their horror, thousands of parents in Honshu, Kyushu, and Shikoku found out that they had been feeding their babies with milk laced with arsenic. The accidental poisoning of large quantities of infant powdered milk was but the last link in a long and complex chain of events related in no small measure to the market dynamics of the Japanese dairy industry. Baby formula was first introduced in Japan during the Taisho era from 1912 to 1925, but most of the production was destined for the export market. Domestic consumption truly boomed only after the end of World War II due to a widespread shortage of food. In 1947, the United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, or UNICEF, initiated the distribution to Japanese families of powdered milk, which became a staple for boys and girls of all ages. Then, from 1948 to 1949, the US experienced the post-war recession, resulting in a surplus of unsold powder milk in the United States. The surplus was exported to Japan, thus growing consumption in that market. As more and more children became reliant on these products, Japanese health authorities recorded a steady decline in infant mortality rates. And it was easy to establish a link of causality. Powdered milk was responsible for healthier children. Right? Well, actually not really, at least according to historian Kichiro Shoji and economist Masaru Sagai, writing for the United Nations University in 1992. Quote, "The main reason for this decrease in infant deaths was related to the development of antibiotics. In reality, the infant death rate is twice as high for artificially fed babies as it is for breastfed ones, since human milk provides the most valuable nutrition that can be had and also protects the new life against infectious diseases." End quote. At the time, however, the government, the industry, and the consumers had drawn the wrong conclusions, and the sector kept on expanding, with three leading companies racking up most of the market share: Yukirishi, Meiji, and Morinaga. In 1951, the government issued a set of regulations for infant milk products, allowing companies to enrich their formula with vitamins and minerals. In this game of one-upmanship, Morinaga proved quite adept at competitive tactics. For example, they introduced a new branding campaign featuring an angel symbolizing protection of infants. At the same time, they introduced products directly addressing the parents, such as creaming powder for frostier coffees. Next, they launched cute baby contests and launched ad campaigns featuring celebrities at the time. Finally, they worked in cooperation with doctors and nurses to set up baby health clinics in Tokyo and Osaka, which gained the approval of the public. As competition grew, the three big companies faced increasing challenges. Demand kept on growing, which meant factories had to ramp up production, but a scarcity of raw material inevitably led to a drop in quality. For example, in March 1955, some 900 elementary school students in Tokyo fell ill with stomach cramps and diarrhea. It became immediately clear that they'd all drunk powdered milk produced by the Yukirishi company. Corporate leadership immediately recalled all cans of the product and issued an apology. There were no further consequences, but the exact cause of the food poisoning was never revealed. By that time, and perhaps also due to the Yukarishi incident, Morinaga had become the undisputed leader in the market of infant milk products with a nationwide share of 60%. Now Morinaga was facing a serious challenge. To keep up with demand, maintain their market dominance, and ensure profits, they had to source dairy milk of increasingly low quality before it was sent to their facilities to be dried and powdered. But they lacked adequate refrigeration facilities. By the time this already low-quality milk reached their plants, it was almost past its expiry date. Morinaga's solution was to increase the use of industrial stabilizer, which they'd actually introduced as early as 1952, disodium phosphate. And as more and more of this stuff was required, its quality plummeted too. These two elements were tragically combined at the Morinaga factory in Tokushima. On April 13, 1955, a batch of almost rotten milk was treated with large quantities of disodium phosphate that had been sourced from industrial waste. More specifically, the chemical had been generated by the Nippon Light Metal Company in Shimizu, a byproduct of refining bauxite into aluminium. The disodium phosphate had been first dispatched to the Japanese National Railways, but they returned the sale. The reason? It contained several impurities, including 5 to 8% arsenic. It appeared that part of the same impure batch had been sold also to several chemical and pharmaceutical companies. Most of them rejected the batch, but at least one purchased the chemical. The Nippon Light Metal Company filed an inquiry with the Ministry of Welfare to ascertain if those levels of arsenic would constitute a poison. Unfortunately, the ministry's response reached the metal company too late. It arrived in November of 1955, after the tragedy had already unfolded. While the inquiry was still pending, the Tokushima factory acquired some of the impure disodium phosphate from one of the chemical and pharmaceutical companies. When the batch reached Tokushima in April, the plant's scales were out of order, resulting in little control over how much additive was being mixed in with the dairy. Subsequent analysis measured the concentration of arsenic at about 21 to 35 micrograms per gram of dried milk. Once the formula was reconstituted, the concentration would have been at 4.2 to 7 milligrams of arsenic per liter of baby milk. According to the WHO, arsenic levels above 10 micrograms per liter are deemed unsafe. So let's consider that again, shall we? Just 10 micrograms of arsenic diluted into 1 liter of liquid are potentially poisonous, and the babies of Okayama and other locations in the area may have drunk as much as 7 milligrams. That's 7,000 micrograms per liter. That's 700 times the unsafe arsenic levels. Following Professor Hamamoto's announcement on August 24th, the Ministry of Public Welfare ordered the recall of all Morinaga milk marked with the MF code and for the closure of the Tokushima plant. While patients admitted to hospitals in Okinawa and other affected areas were prescribed British anti-Lewisite, or BAL, an antidote to arsenic gas developed by the British military. The incident made it to the headlines of local and national newspapers, such as the Asahi Shimbun. Its headline for August 24th read, "Strange illness occurring in bottle-fed babies." The article also reported the official death toll at that time. 3 babies had lost their life so far. The Shanyo Shimbun in Okayama continued to cover the story. Now, the articles did mention the Morinaga milk, but crucially, they failed to do so in the headline, which meant that non-habitual readers of the papers may have missed that vital piece of information and continued to bottle feed their babies with the company's products. On August the 25th, the Morinaga Milk Company issued a formal apology in national newspapers, announcing they would enforce stricter quality controls on their products. This promise would not be very credible, however. Shortly thereafter, the milk produced at 2 more plants in Matsumoto and Hiratsuka were found to be tainted. On the same day, the Okayama University Hospital had to admit 197 more babies. As per the Red Cross Hospital, it was at capacity and infants had to occupy beds in the hallways. That same day, the press reported the total number of patients nationwide as 516. By the 26th, cases had more than doubled. 1,463 babies were suffering the effects of arsenic toxicity, of which 23 had died. By the end of 1955, that number had risen to 130 and would only continue to grow as the years passed. As early as August 27, 1955, the parents of the tiny victims started organizing themselves to bring Morinaga to account. One of them, Mr. Tetsuo Okazaki, took the lead, proposing an alliance of families at the Okayama Red Cross Hospital. The Sanyo Shimbun reported about Mr. Okazaki the following day, inspiring similar alliances across other hospitals and affected areas. The disparate groups held a rally on September the 3rd, during which they agreed to form an alliance of arsenic poisoning victims with Mr. Okazaki as its first chairman. The The alliance tabled talks with Morinaga on September the 6th, during which the company executives agreed to pay compensation for each patient. 3,000 yen for children who were poisoned but had not been hospitalized, and 10,000 yen for each hospitalized patient. These amounts were intended to pay for any ongoing medical care required for each baby. Now, let's put these figures in context. According to Japan's National Tax Agency, in 1955, the average monthly salary for a private sector worker was 15,400 yen, which means that the high end of Morinaga's promised compensation was barely 2/3 of 1 month's wages. Moreover, the effects of arsenic poisoning may require lifelong treatment. Clearly, the alliance of victims' families could not accept such a deal from Morinaga. From then on, a decades-long battle would follow to ensure that the company accepted its responsibilities and provided adequate care to the victims. The Parents Association formalized their status as the Morinaga Milk Victims Association, also known as Zenkyo, and on September the 30th, Zenkyo rejected Morinaga's offer with a counterproposal of their own. Parents of each deceased child should receive 2.5 million yen, while survivors were to have all their medical expenses covered by the company, as well as receiving a compensation of up to 700,000 yen. On October the 5th, Zenkyo and Morinaga held their first negotiation meeting, which ended with the company accepting the parents' demands. But after realizing that the number of victims and parents was much larger than anticipated, executives backed down, asking for the Ministry of Public Welfare to form an advisory committee. The ministry complied with the request without consulting Zenkyo, and on October the 21st created a 5-member committee which included a newspaper publisher, a hospital director, a university lecturer, and 2 lawyers. The committee was intended to be independent and neutral, but it emerged that its expenses were paid by the big 3 milk companies. Moreover, the main committee established a subgroup of 6 pediatricians whose role was to assess the severity of the poisoning in patients. But all 6 of them were doctors who had previously promoted the use of formula milk, which didn't exactly make them unbiased. On December the 5th, the 5-member committee published their deliberations. Their proposal was for Morinaga to pay only 250,000 yen for each death caused by their milk, while survivors would receive up to a maximum of 12,000 yen. In addition, the parents had to agree to the fact that arsenic poisoning had no long-lasting effects on their children. Clearly, the members of Zenkyo were stunned and disappointed by such an unacceptable suggestion, and thus decided to exclude the ministry's committee and to negotiate directly with Morinaga. Zenkyo issued another set of rather acceptable demands. For example, they asked for Morinaga to fund regular medical screenings for survivors and to establish an institute to research and treat the long-term effects of poisoning. Once again, on December the 26th, Morinaga representatives flatly refused, prompting Zenkyo to launch a campaign of demonstrations and boycotts. The company endured the storm, however, as the public who were gradually losing interest in the scandal. As time waned, parents had to abandon protest activities due to just sheer exhaustion. Then, in April 1956, Morinaga dealt the next blow to their worn-down opponents. The company filed a compromise proposal only slightly better than the one suggested by the 5-member committee. The exhausted parents accepted the offer, fearing it was the best they could obtain. But there was an additional catch. As part of the deal, Zenkyo had to be disbanded. All the local chapters agreed to dissolve, but the team based in Okayama Prefecture would have none of that. As one of them later declared, "It was the Morinaga Milk Company who mixed poison with the milk, but it was we parents who gave the poison milk to the children. Therefore, it is our responsibility to take care of these poisoned children. We must live and fight a 10-year battle." And battle they did, creating the Organization to Protect the Poisoned Children of Okayama. In July 1957, that organization went on the attack, wresting from Morinaga a commitment to pay for periodic medical assessment for the poisoned children. Then the organization scored another victory, medical confirmation for 19 of their children that they indeed suffered from the effects of arsenic-tainted milk. And this is a no-brainer to us, but only 2 years earlier, Morinaga had denied that such a thing was even possible. In fact, survivors of the incident presented some clear effects of poisoning, such as eyesight problems, central nervous system conditions, irregular physical development, and learning disabilities. Over the 50s and most of the 60s, these little patients were all seen individually by separate doctors, clinics, and hospitals. No systematic survey of their conditions was conducted, and thus their ailments were all attributed to different causes or diagnosed as congenital disorders. Finally, in 1969, Professor Maruyama at the medical department of Osaka University took the initiative to conduct a survey involving 68 survivors now aged 14 to 15. Unsurprisingly, 80% of them were found to present significant after effects related to arsenic. Maruyama shared his findings on October the 18th, which sparked the creation of yet another parents group, the Morinaga Arsenic Milk Poisoning Protection Association. The new Protection Association attracted the sympathy of a young group of medical researchers who conducted further surveys of the survivors in 1970 and 1971. The first study involved 415 teenagers in Kyoto and found that, quote, poisoning victims had a much higher rate of physical and mental complaints than the control group. Even average height in the victims was less than that of controls of the same age, end quote. These survivors of the poisoning incident presented a high prevalence of central nervous disorders, such as epilepsy or learning disabilities, and a high proportion of them had an IQ below 85. The researchers concluded that the physical and mental defects of the victims were the result of consumption of arsenic-tainted Morinaga dried milk. Moreover, it appeared that these children had received no therapy or support since the incident. A similar study carried out in the Hiroshima prefecture reached even more worrying conclusions. In that geography, a high rate of survivors tested at an even lower IQ, below 50. Such findings sparked another round of negotiations between the Protection Association and Morinaga, as the company still refused to acknowledge the after effects of their negligence and thus had failed to provide adequate medical care. The Ministry of Public Welfare stepped in, agreeing to conduct a large-scale examination of the survivors. As had been the case back in 1955, a third-party committee was put in charge. Their report was published in December 1972. To the dismay of the parents group, it concluded that the arsenic-laced milk was not responsible for the survivors' ailments. This response was far from satisfactory, and in fact, the report may have been far from impartial. As pointed out by the already quoted Shoji and Sugai at the UN University, the report had been funded by Morinaga to the tune of 10 million yen. The Protection Association's next move was to call for a second nationwide boycott of Morinaga products. This time, it proved far more successful, and by December 1972, the company's market share had plummeted to 18%. The association continued their attack on the company, filing a series of lawsuits in 1973. And the tactic paid off. Not only were the director and production chiefs of Morinaga sentenced to 5 years in jail, but even the government admitted partial responsibility. In December 1973, an agreement was reached between the Ministry of Public Welfare, Morinaga, and the Protection Association. According to this agreement, Morinaga had to accept once and for all full responsibility and establish a new body, the Hikari Foundation, to provide finance and medical aid for survivors. In March 1981, the Hikari Foundation and the Ministry of Public Welfare published a new report on the scale of the tragedy. The poisoned baby milk had affected 13,389 victims, a number later updated to 13,451. The death toll, initially placed at 130, had increased over time to 600. An additional 6,093 patients, now in their late 20s, suffered from serious medical conditions, of which 624 were afflicted by severe learning difficulties, developmental difficulties, and paralysis caused by brain damage. By that time, Hikari was supporting the survivors with medical care, education, counseling, occupational therapy, as well as financial aid, having paid almost 830 million yen in compensation in 1981 alone. In more recent times, the long-term effects of the incident were evaluated in further studies. A survey by the Aichi Cancer Center Research Institute and the Osaka Medical Center for Cancer and Cardiovascular Diseases was published in 2010, after monitoring 6,104 survivors from 1982 to 2006. The researchers found that the study cohort did not display significant excess overall mortality, and yet survivors had a much higher than average mortality rate from diseases of the nervous system, with the most prevalent cause of death being asphyxia due to epileptic attack. A second long-term study was conducted on a group of 6,223 survivors by Osaka University and the Osaka International Cancer Institute. Over the period of 1982 to 2018, researchers found that the once babies, now aged in their early 60s, demonstrated, quote, a significant decrease in cancer incidence rates. Compared to the population average, nonetheless, the cohort of poisoned individuals still showed a statistically significant increase in mortality rate for all causes: nervous system disease, respiratory disease, genitourinary system disease, and traffic accidents. Today, the Morinaga Milk Company is still active and thriving, engaging in charitable donations and ethical programs to improve children's nutrition in Japan and abroad. After decades of negotiations and legal struggles, it eventually admitted to its responsibility and atoned for the damage it had caused. But the findings we quoted above are a stark reminder of how a single act of corporate carelessness may plunge a generation of young victims and their families into the shadows of death, disease, and despair.